Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode 91, and Maggie and I are joining you today to discuss the War of the Rohirrim. We've been pushing this back for several weeks because we didn't want to have a spoiler-heavy discussion like within days of the
Early
release. Yeah, so we've been
and we
kind of
like
waiting.
Christmas.
Yes,
So yeah.
that too.
But
But
also our next 3 weeks are just War of the Rohirrim. So this
yes, we're really
this feels like a good starting point to dive in.
exactly. So, I'm on the subject of which, would be really interested to hear anything you particularly wanted to discuss from us. We would be, I'd be delighted to respond to questions that you had or like issues that you wanted to see us talk about the film. So yeah, we're of course also working on our Kickstarter, on the documentary for which we have our Kickstarter. So I wanted to remind folks about the Kickstarter. We're trying to raise some money in order to make not a Rings. So this is going to be it's going to be a Rings and Realms production, but it's going to be a new Rings and Realms production, a new sort of Rings and Realms production. And what we're working on is the hearing you're typing there, Maggie.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I was That's very distracting and very rude. I'm sorry. I just sent a message to the Discord being like, guys, if you want to ask us questions, come on
Right,
over.
right.
So
Yes,
they now
exactly.
have a link.
More
I will stop
questions.
typing.
There we
My
go.
apologies.
No worries.
I'm
No
done.
worries.
I'm done.
But anyway, so we're going to be doing a documentary style discussion. So those of you who are familiar with Rings and Realms know that those were kind of more sort of open-ended, sort of rambling discussions. We're making something much more focused and much more highly produced this time, and we're going to be incorporating not only our own, analysis from Maggie and analysis from me, and analysis from Kirsten Cairns from theonering.net, Green Dragon from theonering.net, but also some interview material from cast and crew. It's going to be a really fun project to do and to be working on and releasing. So we're kind of preparing for that, and there's a lot that we've been thinking about this film. But what we want to do today is just kind of have our basic sort of Other Minds and Hands discussion of the adaptation and the adaptation choices that were made. It was interesting.
Which, like,
Yeah, go ahead.
in and of itself, I feel like this has been a really fun exercise for me and Corey because like we're focusing on this like scripted, super produced, researched, organized, structured, like really cool professional industry documentary. But that's very different to what we do normally and this. And it's been interesting to kind of make that line and be
Yes.
like, no, we're not talking about that here, but we can talk about that there. And
Yes.
yeah, I think we were both pretty excited for tonight to just have a chat because we haven't actually shared many opinions with each other about the film. So we
Yeah.
thought this would be fun to start discussing.
Yeah, so it was interesting. I mean, so I'll just start thinking about its relationship with the text. So one thing that's noteworthy is that, categorically speaking, this is a fill in the blanks adaptation, right? However, it's a fill in the blanks adaptation, which is not targeting just a blank space, but it's targeting a short story in the context of like a chronological overview. The text that we have, the story of Helm Hammerhand that we have from Appendix A, is part of the sequence of like, I'm going to tell you about like the kings of Rohan, right? I'm going to list for you the kings of Rohan and tell you one or two nuggets of interest, of historical interest that happened during their reigns, right? And the story of Helm Hammerhand gets more attention than most because interesting and sensational things happened there. But it's still only a very brief synopsis. Again, less brief than others. We get, for instance, a little bit of dialogue in some places, right? Some scenes get developed that fully, so fully that we have like a whole paragraph on them. But again, the context of it is just a very brief reference to the major things that happened during that reign. So on the one hand, they're retelling. We do get a story, like we do get a narrative of what happened, in the rather sensational career of Helm Hammerhand, and a couple incidents from that, including the fight with Freyka. That's where we get the dialogue between Helm and Freyka. Some dialogue, I should say, between Helm and Freyka. And then also we get the siege of Helm and the why it gets to be called Helm's Deep. By the way, I did find that a little bit funny. There's that moment in the film when Hera's like, this place has always been called the Hornburg, but it shall not be called the Hornburg any longer. It shall be known as Helm's Deep. And I'm like, well, okay, so on the one hand, yes, it was called Helm's Deep after that. On the other hand, it didn't start getting called the Hornburg until it was Helm's Horn that they named that after, too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In fact,
Well,
both of those names are after Helm. I'm not even sure what they called it back before Helm took refuge there, but I'm pretty sure that Helm's Horn is the horn in question that they called the Hornburg after. But anyway, so on the one hand, it's in a faithful retelling, but it's not. I still can't classify it as a retelling adaptation, because a retelling adaptation is where you have like a fully developed story, like a novel or a shorter story, and you're trying to do that. So you're translating that story in some sense into the film medium, the visual medium. And so that's not what was happening here, right? The story of Helm Hammerhand that we get in Appendix A is not a sufficiently fleshed out story, in my opinion, to count as something that they're just retelling. Which is why I found a lot of things people were saying was like, oh, it's very, very faithful to the text. And I'm like, well, okay. I mean, first of all, we're always uncomfortable with that phrase.
That's a statement.
Yeah. But again, I felt myself wanting to draw like distinctions, right? Be like, okay, it is true that most of the details that are mentioned in very short, right, are incorporated, in fact, in the story. So like that's, in that sense, yes. And there are very few things that they put in that are like openly falsified by the text, right? If you compare them with the text, like that say things that happened that the text, that are actively inconsistent, not just omitted by, but actively inconsistent with the text. And yes, exactly as Brave Brown Bear says, it's easy to be faithful when there's so little to be faithful to. Yes.
And I think everything you're saying is right. Of like, this isn't quite a fill in the blanks, but this isn't quite a direct adaptation. Like, this is somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
But I think for like all intents and purposes, it is a fill in the blank because we're given just lots of little blanks. We're taking this 2 pages. Yeah. And just growing it. It's an expansion pack.
Exactly. As was, and this we've talked about in talking about this, but the whole, the choice of Hera as the protagonist of the film is exactly that, right? The Helm's daughter is in fact the premise of the initial thing. Like the question of Helm's daughter marrying Wolf Freyka's son is in fact the initial cause of the dispute between Freyka and Helm. Like that's there in the text. The daughter isn't named, and she's never mentioned again in the story, right? And the
dispute isn't really detailed either.
Well, no, right? Not really. Not really. I mean, this is, to me, where it got most interesting. The thing that really kind of caught my eye, because on the one hand, again, I had heard, even before I saw it, I had heard people saying, oh, it was really, they really stuck to the details in the text very carefully. And I found, like, on the one hand, I didn't disagree with that. Like, it's true that most of the things the text says are there, and most of the things that are there in the film are at least consistent with what's there in the text, even though there are many things that the text doesn't mention, i.e. the intervention of eagles or the presence of elephants or any of that stuff, right? So like, but anyway, whatever, like none of those things are actively inconsistent with what it says in the text. That's the fill in the blank stuff. However, when I found myself actually comparing, and this was especially true, I was more on first viewing. I was more struck by the similarities. On second viewing, I was more struck by differences. So, like, for instance, the similarities in the confrontation between Freka and Helm at the beginning, like that, there was a lot that, including one line of the dialogue in the text, got put word for word in the film. One of the only lines in the film that was word for word out of the books.
Yeah.
And that was Freka's line about the king who rejects a proffered staff may fall upon his knees. But that's where it got interesting to me, because, again, I was noticing those similarities the first time, but the second time I was noticing the differences. Like, so for instance, they quote Freka saying that to Helm. They did not quote Helm's response to Freka, where he says, and, you know, the king who rejects a proffered staff may break it. So, and then he punches him to death in the face, right? So that is to say, in the text, based on Helm's statement, it seems perfectly clear that Helm fully intended to kill Freka with that blow. Whereas Film Helm is not only like is actively saying afterward, he's shocked, and he's actively saying afterwards, like, I only hit him the once, like you all saw, like he didn't mean to kill him, like it was he was protesting. Film Helm was protesting that it was an accident, and that is, to me, like, it's part of a big deal that then got me to thinking about other choices that they had made there. Notice how they changed. So in the book account, Freka says the rude which is a legitimately rude and offensive comment to the king. Uppity, rude, in your face, challenging his authority. Like, Freka did make that comment. And Helm, in the book, responds to it. He brushes it off at first. And he says that we'll talk about it later. And as soon as the meeting, because they're in a meeting, they're talking about other things. And then after the meeting is done, he seizes Freka. He has Freka seized by his Helm's guards. And they keep Freka's own people at bay. And they frog march Freka outside, right? He's like, let's take this outside. And Freka's not given an option, right? He is frog marched by Helm's guards outside. And then Helm confronts him personally, delivers his response, and then punches him to death, right? Helm is taking no, I mean, it's an extremely strong, authoritative thing for him to do.
Whereas this feels more like a bar fight, where it's like, let's step outside.
Yeah,
like,
well, and even
doing this in the hall.
And it's given that, so, like, in the film, first of all, Freka is absolutely, like, it is explicitly the whole thing, the whole meeting is from the beginning a challenge of Helm's authority. Like, this is not just a challenge to his authority. This is not just a comment that could be taken as an insult or as a threat. Again, he did threaten Helm in the book. But he seemed to do so in anger, in the heat of a moment about something else. In the film, he calls the meeting and shows up to the meeting. This is like a usurpation in progress.
Well, and that makes it way stronger in terms of a confrontation. Like,
yes,
you would need some sort of instigating element. This is film, not 2 pages of text. Like, in a film, you would need an instigating activity to make something like that rise to action. So that makes sense to me, like, instead of Freka just being like a pill and Helm being like beat down, let's make Helm slightly more hesitant, a little bit more of a gentle leader, but still a strong old dude, and kills the guy in one blow. Like, that is way more engaging, I think, as a inciting circumstance.
Yeah, they emphasize Helm is strong, but just and fair. He's
reasonable.
Reasonable. I mean,
he reassures everybody else in the room, like, it's okay, I got this,
Yeah, he had every right. Film Helm had every right to call in his soldiers, have Freyka and his men seized and executed. Like, he could have done that. Instead, he goes through this whole, I mean, the fist fight becomes not a trial by combat, but it becomes a sort of a duel, like for the crown, essentially.
And I was going to ask you that, like, is there any kind of precedent for that? That feels like a weird way to govern, to just be like,
Yeah.
I mean, bar fight made sense to me. Like, you've hurt my feelings, we got to have this out, as opposed to you could actually usurp me in this moment.
It seemed to me, like, especially when I was watching it the second time, I was really focusing on this scene. And it seemed to me that the implication is that if Freyka had won that fist fight with Helm, he would have claimed the throne.
Yeah.
And there would even have been... Helm seemed to sort of dare him to do that. I think it seems to me that Helm was actually putting his own crown in jeopardy by agreeing to the duel, which is one of the reasons why Hera was like, "Don't do this." I
think that's the part that I was like, "What? Like, what's in it for him?" I mean, he doesn't seem to be that proud that he can't find another route around this confrontation.
So, I felt that it made, from one perspective, a kind of political sense. In the film they emphasize how rich and powerful Freyka had gotten. That Helm acknowledges that Freyka represents a real faction within Rohan, and that if he simply seized or executed Freyka, he wouldn't be solving the problem, right? He wouldn't be like that. That would still leave this whole disaffected group of people who were supporting Freyka. And so he didn't want to do that. So he was like, so he chose to take an unnecessary risk, like legally unnecessary. Like there was nothing compelling him to agree to that duel. But by doing the duel, he reaffirms his own, like by succeeding in the duel, he reaffirms his own claim. So like all of the people, all of the people who might have been leaning towards Freyka are like, okay, Helm, but both by showing that he's willing to put it to the hazard, right? Showing that confidence in himself and then winning, right? Okay, fine. Like it's legit. We should all follow Helm because, he's, he's like the bad boy in charge and we're gonna, we're gonna obey now. That seemed to be what he was going for and succeeded in gaining, at least for that time. So again, it was much more like political machinations. The comparison Eric is making to Black Panther, the duel between Killmonger and T'Challa. It was
very similar. Right?
Yes, it is similar in that way. The sort of the political context of it felt similar to that, which again, the original fight between Helm and Freyka, this was a like quasi-legal execution, right? I say quasi, it wasn't illegal. He didn't like it was not an act of murder by Helm against Freyka. But it was quasi-legal in the sense of being outside of the normal judicial process. It was more bar fight-like in the sense that he's like, we're having a dispute. You uttered some fighting words. We should take this outside.
Let's go settle this out. Yeah. It feels like it's such a civilized land. You'd think there would be other routes besides this. So I guess the film Helm made more sense to me because his reaction was as shocked as we were of like, oh, I didn't think it'd go like this, you know?
Right. Yeah, he succeeded a little bit more than he meant to. And that the film seems to ask us, well, okay, Wolf's character asks us to believe that this is some kind of violation on Helm's part. Even though, again, like, this is one of the things I admit I had a hard time with in the film. Because Wolf was like, you killed my father. It's like, in a fair duel. Like, he challenged me, and then I killed him in a fair duel. What are you complaining about? Right? You were there. You saw the whole thing, right?
This was like one of 4 overreactions, in my opinion, in this film. Like, I really enjoyed the film. Let's just make that statement. Yes. But there were so many little things where I'm like, that doesn't measure up. And the reactions of like, okay, Wolf, I understand grief and being betrayed, but like, betrayed doesn't quite fit this scenario. Your
No.
dad walked into that knowing what could
Your
happen.
dad started it, completely
Yeah.
started it. Helm didn't ask for that
Asked
at
for it.
all.
Like not even like, oh, he was asking for it. No, he literally
He
asked
literally
for it.
requested
Yeah.
it and
Yes.
then took the first shots, right? You know, like it.
Yep.
And again, that's, I mean, the joke I was making after I saw, when I was talking to my family afterwards, because I saw this with my, my son, Matthias, the anime fan, and my wife. And, the joke I was making afterwards was like, I'm like, note in the book, Helm shot first. You know, like that's, whereas in the film, right, they have Freyka come and hit him 3 times, right? And Helm takes the shots and then hits him the once.
But also like picturing a writer's room, that would make sense. Like we need something to kind of push this forward. So what would really jettison us into this action? It would be a massive betrayal, a question of leadership, a foe that is, seemingly in a rightful place because he's a princeling, but really jilted, has followers that are kind of shady, and isn't actually in a position that should assume a throne.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was really interested. So my focus was on how it depicted Helm's character and how it differed from the book. And some of the major differences that I would point to, like the adaptation choices that they were making, seemed to me consistently to say Helm is a just, fair, patient, diligent, thoughtful leader. That is, I wouldn't apply like any of those adjectives to Book Helm. Like Book Helm is like the great alpha male of Rohan. You know, like you don't mess him. Like he is patient in the sense that he doesn't reach up and punch Freyka immediately as soon as Freyka insults him. But even that is like a certain show of bravado on his part. Like, okay, note that you just insulted me, and I'm not going to forget it. And there will be a reckoning soon. But I'm like, compared. I mean, there's like a Beowulf sort of feeling to it, where he's like, you're boasting. I'm not even gonna. I don't even acknowledge you. Right, like you're not even important enough for me to stop this meeting and punch you in the face right now, right? Yeah. And he's like, he blows it off. He's like, the marriage of your son is a trifle. Well, whatever. We'll talk about that later. And he's not even going to acknowledge. So it's an act of greater bravado for him to say, I'm not even going to acknowledge that insult right now. I'm not forgetting it, mind. Yeah. But and when it comes time to remember it, I'm going to remember it, and I'm going to come out and I'm going to punch you to death right in the face. Anyway, he's not. So he has that degree of patience, but not the rest of it. It's very warrior king culture. I see people asking about that Eric's comment is really interesting. Eric has studied a lot of Old English stuff, and he says it's like the film wavers between presenting the Rohirrim like Anglo-Saxons of the 4th century or Anglo-Saxons of the 11th century. Yes, yeah, exactly. It's the helm hammerhand that we get in the text is, first of all, it contains, incidentally, one of the most explicit Beowulf, like one of the 3 most explicit Beowulf references in all of the Lord of the Rings material. Not here, not in the punching Freyka part, in the Madness of Helm part in Helm's Deep. The part, you remember the part, Maggie, in the film where the Dunlendings are saying that like he bears no weapons and no weapon can kill him. Yeah. That is A, straight from the text, and B, straight from Beowulf. Grendel could not be no weapon would, he bore no weapons and no weapon would bite on him. So Tolkien explicitly puts Monster Helm in the Grendel spot. He connects him explicitly to Grendel when he's going out. So Helm sneaking out of Helm's Deep and grabbing and murdering the Dunlendings with his bare hands. He's Grendel.
Yeah.
And he's made the camp of the Dunlending attackers, besiegers, like Heorot, right? I mean, it's really, really interesting. But yeah, yeah. Yes, Eric, I agree. I know that this comparison won't help too many people, but it is interesting. Eric says it's like they took Beowulf, renamed him Helm, and then plopped him onto King Alfred's throne. That is a much later Anglo-Saxon king.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, but I think what you're also alluding to, though, is that I think the production team definitely cherry picked from
yeah.
different
Totally.
references, and that's kind of cool. That we are drawing from all these different influences. And there's Norse culture, there's Viking culture. There's definitely some Beowulf in there. There's Peter Jackson's Rohan. There's a lot of different stuff that they're drawing from.
Yes.
So in terms of adaptation, it's quite the pantry they have to create this story.
Yes.
And Helm, I don't know, like, I see what you're saying of like the alpha male from the text. He was a softer version of that in the
For sure.
film, but I wouldn't call him a sensitive, patient king.
No,
He was kind of a jerk and like
just
ready
much
to
less
ship,
so than in the book.
yeah, ready to ship his daughter off and be like, "You're gonna forget our ways. You're not gonna do anything. You're not allowed to do our traditions anymore because I'm gonna marry you to somebody I don't know." Like,
Right.
he wasn't kind. I think he thought that was kind, but
Yeah.
yeah, I, I wouldn't want to live with him. I think it would be tricky in book or text, Helm, to
Yeah.
hang out with that guy.
Agreed. Agreed. There were
Book
other
or
ways that I felt that they kind of. I was about to say tried to redeem Helm. Redeem is too strong a word because it's
okay.
not like they're taking a bad guy and turning him into a good guy. But other ways in which they tried to soften Helm. His affection and respect for Hera. Now, I agree that that has limits, as you were just describing. Like the whole I'm going to ship you off to Gondor thing.
But you did see a fatherly.
You did. And not only
Yeah.
that, but even like there are some other things, which again, I didn't really process the first time I saw it. Olwen. Like the indirect way.
I want a whole film of Olwen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. In some ways, she was the best character in the film. But the understated way I felt in which. So Olwen herself tells the story of how Helm commends her as a shield maiden. Right. Mm-hmm. Then we learn later that on the day that Hera was born, Olwen becomes her. So Helm, his wife dies in childbirth, right? So on the day Helm's wife dies and Hera is born, he chooses a woman to be her guardian and like surrogate mother throughout her life. And the woman that he chooses for that is the woman that he commended as a shield maiden before.
Yeah.
Right. So Helm chooses to set Hera up in this like shield maiden line, right? So Olwen, I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from Olwen, but it was clear that Helm was like very deliberately complicit in that whole thing. And so therefore, when it comes back around to Helm in that final conversation with Hera, both before and after they go running through the camp, like right after the troll fight, and then right at the gates, before Helm dies. In both of those places, the words that he said, about how he, how much he had always loved her, how, what he had always thought of her, how strong she was, and everything, got a little bit of extra weight from me in like once I saw between the first and second time seeing the film the way that Helm had been sort of responsible for that, like the shield maiden training and guardian that he gave her the whole time. Yeah.
I feel like we need to refocus.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, we've wandered. Well, we've been wandering around, not necessarily wandering.
I know. We didn't even start with like overarching ideas. Like, nope, let's just start talking about a thing. I'm okay with that. Let's keep going talking about a thing. Okay, so we had Helm. Do you want to go into like how he turns into madness or follow the wolf line? Or
the madness of Helm was really interesting. It's definitely one of the things I want to talk about more in the documentary, because to me, that was one of the most interesting things. The way that they handled it, the way that because that was always going to be, I was really focused on that. Like, that was high on my list of things I was excited to see how they would handle in the film. Because on the one hand, it is the one-shot punch Freyka to death moment is a fun Helm moment. Like, that's how he gets the name Hammerhand, right? He is the consistent, that's his sort of signature moment, right? In that way. However, the mythic horrible, but like mythically horrible stories of him going mad with grief and sneaking out by night and killing enemy soldiers with his bare hands. And, is he Grendel? Is he a troll? Is he eating the bodies of the people he takes? Like the way that legends grow up about Helm, among the Dunlendings who are besieging him. That's a really, it's one of the most, and then like Helm dies one of the most metal deaths in all of Tolkien. Like, he's absolutely top 10, right? With, the Helm, the troll, like monstrous Helm sneaks out one night and he doesn't come back. And then there he is, still standing there over the camp, frozen in place, standing up, and they're still afraid. Like, they're still terrified to come near him. Anyway, like, that's so eerie and memorable. And so anyway, so my question was, like, how are they going to handle that? Are they going to be able to convey the mythic and eerie power of that story? Because I knew, because this is a movie, right? One of the ways in which let me change how I was going to say. Let me just say what I was going to say and then I'll correct it. I was going to say one of the things that enables Tolkien to capture that in the book is the fact that he does not have a personalized story. This is just part of a chronology, right? But I want to correct that and say, Tolkien was able to take advantage of the context, right? He can do that. He can establish that kind of a mythic presence in one paragraph, in part because it's a totally different kind of narrative, very similar to a lot of the things that happen in the Silmarillion, by the way, where you don't like get to know a character on a day-to-day basis. What's he like? What does he say? What kind of coffee does he drink? Like, we don't know these things about characters in the Silmarillion because the narrative is from way high up, right? Yeah. And I knew that taking this story, this nugget of a story that we have in Appendix A, and fleshing it out into a film, we were going to get to know Helm personally much better. And therefore, and of course, he has a very close emotional relationship with the protagonist, his daughter. So even as being really important in her life, he was going to be important personally in different ways. And so if we care about him as a person, again, it's easy to be like, ooh, like, cool, scary, freaky, frozen troll Helm is like mythic and awesome. But you can't just do that. And also ask us to invest in him personally and in people who are invested in him personally, right? So how are they going to take the, Helm is parent, Helm is father, so that Helm is father, Helm is king. How are the people? We never even learn how the people respond. Like all those really fun moments in the film where they were like, I loved that when that kid was like, has the king become a monster? I loved that, right? Like that's exactly the kind of questions that are going to be asked. Nobody asks that. We don't get that whole perspective.
We don't get that in the text.
We don't get that in the text. Anyway, so the way that had to be balanced together.
And you can see why that's so attractive in terms of adaptation. Like, we have these 2 pages of mythical, interesting, but factual, very dry, for lack of a better word. And, to see those 2 pages and be able to fill in those gaps and to be able to pull out these interesting things and then be able to draw that together, like, you can see why this chunk of text would be super juicy to want to play with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No. So, and I will say in general, I thought that the balance there was handled really, really well. And the fascinating thing was that they handled it
by having Helm absent, right? They
Yeah.
they were just, it was like rumors and whispers about Helm on both sides is
Yes.
how we got that, right? And then of course culminating in the moment when Hera finds him and we have the encounter between Helm and Hera with the even more fascinating addition of a snow troll who looks like Helm's evil cousin, right?
See, I hadn't even thought of that until you mentioned it in our meeting the other day. Where like I can see that. I would love to be able to ask that question of the creators and be like, did you overtly mean to have this physical representation of his madness? Because that's what we're seeing.
It's, yeah, I mean, it was like it was like a piece of enacted allegory in the middle of it, because there's no implication. Now, the one implication is that when the body's vanished, and then they're like, the Dunlendings are like, he's eating the flesh of the dead, right? No, there was a real troll there who actually did eat the flesh of the dead. So they literalized the eating of the flesh of the dead. But it's not Helm who didn't, so the troll, but I don't think there was any implication that it was really the troll all along or something that had been killing the Dunlendings and
No, no,
not
no,
Helm at
no.
all.
I mean, we actually have Helm battling the troll hand to hand. Like
Right,
there
and
is,
then Helm, yes, and then Helm attack.
yeah.
So, but then Helm fighting, like that scene with Helm and the troll fighting each other, it was like absolutely like this allegorized moment of the king fighting the monster within and overcoming it. And how does he overcome it? Because Hera stabs it in the eye with her spear and then enables him. And then even like the brutality of Helm with that boulder, bashing it in the head again and again,
Yeah.
and like beating its head, which is the part of it that looked most like Helm, into slurry on the ground. Was again, and from that moment, like, and lo and behold, as soon as the troll is dead, Helm's back, right? And that's when he and Hera have this discussion. He's been recovered at that point, and then he continues fighting the Dunlendings, but now instead he's fighting like a Rohirrim king at the gates of the Hornburg, rather than fighting like a troll in the night, like a monster in the night.
I'm gonna request to share my screen if you can.
Oh, of course.
Because I'm like, let's just take a gander at this. So I've got these two images next to each other anyway. I mean, yep.
It was the white beard. There's no reason to give the troll a white beard. And then they're fist
And the
fighting.
shoulder shape, I mean, I can see it, Corey.
Yep, totally fighting himself. Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, don't mind us. I'm like,
Yeah, it was I was too, the troll, like the literal troll took me by surprise on first viewing. So I spent critical moments the first time watching the movie like, wait, what? There's actually a troll? Like, because I know like troll is, he's compared to a troll in the, so I'm like, now there's an actual troll and he's fighting it? Like, what? I was confused my first time through. When I was expecting it the second time, I was like, oh, now I'm picking this up.
I feel like I had some broader scope questions the first time because I was like, I don't know, the core of the text. I went back and read it later, but then was like, that's still not helping me. Did he actually become a wraith? Is he actually
Right.
supernatural? Like,
Right.
they were vague enough in the film
Yep.
to kind of play into that. But then again, watching it again, you explore a little bit why they might have made the decisions the way that they did. And kind of keeping that vagueness helped me lean into the mythical idea of Helm. So you can see how that legend would persist. Because if we're not actually sure and we're in it, and people are asking questions, did the king become a monster?
Yes.
Like, you're not sure either. So
And so
can
you know
see
that
how
story is
versus
going to
what we know.
continue because people
Right.
are, the kid who is asking that is never going to forget, those stories. Right.
And was he the one that was given the harp? Maybe. I don't know. Did we
I
get
think,
some?
well, she takes it back from him anyway. So that kid's, out of luck when it comes to harp
And
playing.
then still
but-
doesn't write her own songs about herself. I mean, just
Yes.
That's our next point. We haven't even mentioned Hera yet. We have a lot to discuss,
Yes.
but
Yes, we do. We do.
yeah.
But
But I
anyways,
think the Madness of Helm, I think, is a really interesting one
I
in
thought it
terms
was
of like
fascinating, and it was
how
my
did they
favorite part of
take
the
what
film.
they had? Yeah, how they took what they had and turned that into a visual representation.
Yeah, and did a lot with it. That is, they, and this is so often the case in an adaptation where you have to, or like you have the opportunity, if you can pull it off, both to try to replicate through your different means and medium a similar kind of effect that to preserve an effect that the book has, and do that, convey that effect, which is nothing like as easy as most people think it is. Right? Just stay true to the text. How hard is that? Man, when you're translating to a totally different medium, really hard, in fact. Anyway, there's that, but then there's also to add extra layers on top of it, right? To have it do other things as well,
Yeah.
which the text never even tries to make it do. And so that's why, as I say, I love the Madness of Helm. I thought it was really cool.
And that's also like a really fun example of when you're talking about intention, because the intention of the original passage is just conveying information. The intention of the film is telling a legendary crazy story, filling in all the gaps, giving us well-developed characters, relationships, tensions. So intention is going to be real different for us to want to see how that plays out. Don't need that from the text. So there's lots of different ways to show that on the film.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's one version.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. We should
Talk about our heroine.
we should talk about Hera.
We should
I'd
talk
like to
about
talk
Hera.
about the Eagles too,
Okay.
but I don't know if we'll have time. Let's talk about Hera at least.
Okay.
I really, on a like scene by scene basis, I really enjoyed Hera. I really liked that character. You'll remember, we talked about this before I saw the film, right? And I said one of the things that I was going to be really interested in was looking at the at least implicit parallel between Hera and Eowyn, right? We have these two shield maiden Rohirrim princesses, basically. Though applying the word princess seems really weird in the Rohirrim
We're
context.
talking about
but
royalty lineage. It doesn't
yeah,
mean that she's
exactly.
a pretty princess. She's
Yeah,
just a princess.
it's not a Disney princess, but anyway. So there's that comparison was something I was really interested in, and I thought that there were definitely elements of that that I thought were conveyed very interestingly. Her character was not just derivative of Eowyn's. Like, they didn't try to... One thing that they might have done, but didn't do, was try to, like, orchestrate Hera's circumstances to be more directly parallel to Eowyn's, but they didn't do that. So, like, the choices that she had available to her, the challenges that she was facing were quite different. So there were some basic parallels of their positions, but it was certainly not a retelling of that same story in any way. And I like that. I like the independence of Hera's story in that way, but I still found it an interesting kind of contemplation of the question, like, what is the context of a noble woman? I feel the need to emphasize that because there is no sense in which either Eowyn's story or Hera's story are merely stories about women in this culture, because more than 99.99% of women in this culture are not in Hera or Eowyn's position. They're not princesses, right? They're not, they have different pressures and different contexts and different demands upon them in different stories entirely. And in fact, there was in this sense comparatively little. The only sort of feminine specific, like woman specific issue in Hera's life was marriage, like the marriage question. Who's she going to get married off to, and how is she going to handle her being married off? I'm not talking about like the overall circumstance, like the overall frame. That came off sounding too strong. What I mean is, she,
My face isn't judging you for that. My face is thinking through the other things that she had to contend with. So
yeah,
there's certainly the marriage question, it being out of her hands, it being her
yes,
destiny,
and the question
all
of
that
her
kind of stuff.
relationship to the
And
choice.
not being allowed to fight. The relationship with her brothers was very different. The relationship with
Yes.
her dad was very different than that of her brothers.
And
You
that's,
know,
by the way, that the fighting thing is one of the things that seems to me to be, I mean, that isn't a, I mean, most men and women in Rohan don't face that question of whether or not they're allowed to fight. Like,
hmm
it seems to me worth noting that this is also the both of those issues, like Eowyn's desire to do deeds of note on the field of battle, right? Again, that's not an aspiration that most Rohirric women get the opportunity to even think about, or men, for that matter, right? She
yeah.
is of the line of Eorl, right? She compares herself to her brother fairly. Yeah, they're both, you know, children of the line of
It'd be
Eorl.
hard not to be. I mean, even if they had never had to contend with that thought before, it would be really hard not to think that's what you're supposed to do though in her shoes. Like she was raised by a shield maiden. She's the fastest rider in the entire land.
Mm-hmm.
She's clearly very capable with weaponry. She was trained from a very young age with a sword and a shield. It would be hard if under threat to not think you could be helpful when everyone has told you you are extremely good at this.
Sure.
And
Oh, no,
yeah,
absolutely. And I agree. There was I felt, if anything, I felt it was underdeveloped. Like that,
mm,
how on the one hand, again, Helm seems to have conspired to give her
yeah,
shield maiden training. And yet, when it comes time for battle, everyone's like, yeah, no, it's not
you
like an
shouldn't do
issue.
that.
Yeah. And I'm like, really? But like, anyway,
But she's real good. Like
yes, yes,
that dude with the hay fork has never trained before. Like
yes.
she just took down an Oliphant by herself. So, and I really liked stuff like that too, where, it wasn't her trying to be. I'm rolling my eyes a little bit at the people that are like, oh, it's just a strong female lead. That's a whole other episode for us one day. But
Yes.
like, I really appreciated that they didn't just try to make her manly.
Yes.
Like her attributes were speed, cunning, skill, lithe. Like she was just real freaking good in her
Hmm.
own set of skills and her own body and her own abilities. It wasn't her trying to like be as good as the boys, you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
But she was the faster rider. She was all those things that made her a lot more functional. I appreciated that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and honestly, ways it seemed fairly clear in which she was, I mean, I felt we were being clearly told that she was better suited to going out with the warriors than
Mm,
her brother Hama was.
yeah. And I liked Hama too. Like we actually got a sensitive prince and he played music and he told stories and he was on that slow fat wonderful little pony and so it was nice to have like slightly more rounded characters and not just the stereotypical, which is I think why I balked against Helm a little bit too, because I was like, seriously dude, but it makes more sense when you're drawing it out of the text.
Hmm.
Helm, that this is kind of a compromise.
Yeah,
The
oh, he
Helm
was so toned down.
softened. Yeah,
Yeah, in
that's a
that way.
softened Helm, go
He was
figure.
he was he was the softened. That was the domesticated Helm for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um yes. Yeah, and
And
I do agree, Eric. That's the two things. Well, I guess three things that I would point to. Again, along the lines, Maggie, that you're pointing to. She had the one like really practical skill in her skill as a writer, which is a big deal in Rohan in particular, right? And worthy of respect. There was her resourcefulness, her defeat of her disposal of at least two of the Mumakil, right, was done by her cleverness and preparation rather than and thinking on her feet, rather than by like Legolas esque acts of ridiculous physical prowess. Um, and and then the third thing was genuine leadership skill as well.
yeah.
Even, I mean, I loved the moment where her brothers can get back to the city after the battle and are like, quick, everyone must evacuate. And she's like, yeah, we already took care of that. Actually, I came to the same decision some time ago and enacted it. So don't worry about it. And that was fun. And Eric, I agree. She was certainly a more prudent leader than Helm was. And watching her become more consciously that leader from the moment they get to Helm's Deep and Helm is incapacitated, she is clearly in charge and is well, I say she's clearly in charge. She is clearly taking charge, even though she seemed to be not officially in charge.
Well, and I quite liked that there was like a fairly natural push and pull against that. Like, it seems like she has a very innate skill and ability of leadership, but she's not allowed to have that role in her society. So there's something of herself that kind of keeps that in check until she's like, oh, no, we have to do that. So I can see how that can be construed as like a weak female, but I really don't think it is. I think that's a female that's working within the confines of the culture that she's in, and she is an incredible leader, but she's a bit limited by where she is, and then has to take that leap to be like, nobody else, here I am, and stepping into that shield maiden role. She just doesn't know that she's a shield maiden.
Right. Yeah. The moment where we can see that tension between the role that she's actually taken and the role that she's like allowed to take is that moment when the actual leaders, like the thanes and military captains, are gathered together in that council room, and she comes in the Aragorn door, right? And pushes them open with two hands like Aragorn did, right? Which, by the way, remember that parallel that we noticed in the trailer, right? Where they were explicitly paralleling the two of them. That didn't make much sense in the context of the trailer to me, as we discussed at the time. It made much more sense within the context of the film, because what was Aragorn's role in film Battle of Helm's Deep? In the film Battle of Helm's Deep, Aragorn was the leader, who was the one who was really in charge, but he's also the outsider who's not from Rohan, right? So he's not officially in charge, but he was totally in charge. And
nice
he was not king, but everyone listened to him and did what he said, right? And so Hera was in that role. So she pushes open the Aragorn doors, right? And there's all the leaders basically saying everything's horrible and we have to give up. And she gives them, it's not a pep talk in the sense that she's trying to cheer them up. She's just like, this is what's going to happen, and this is what we're going to do. And then she walks out. Like, so she doesn't go up and sit down at the head of the table and be like, all right, boys, I'm in charge now. She just comes in, lays down the law, says, this is obviously what we have to do. Now y'all carry on doing whatever useless and unnecessary discussion you guys are doing.
Like every high functioning woman ever, right? Just walks in, it's like, this is what we got to do. Just take care of business. Right.
And I'm in the middle of doing it. Like, it's not just like, I plan to do this. It's like, I've been doing this. I'm doing it right now. I'm going to carry on doing it. Yeah. So that was one of the moments where I thought there was a real acknowledgement of, because most of the film we're following her, so we don't even know what the leaders of the army are doing at the time, and don't care.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
No, they were totally nameless except for the one who betrayed them, and for Freyalov, whom we should come back to also. But
oh god, we're gonna have to do another episode, okay? Because next week we also have a guest, which we'll I don't know if you'll mention now, but we're not gonna be able to talk about it next week, and then we're together filming, so maybe we do it from the studio and just keep talking.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, there's a lot I want to say about Hera, but I don't want to just turn into like a whinge session. But I feel like we have to acknowledge the beast in the room. That Corey and I talked about this after we had both seen it.
My biggest complaint. Not complaint.
Complaint is, I know.
The thing that jarred and kept jarring when I saw it the second time.
My biggest issue in terms of adaptation structure, like what you showed me, every sign that I was reading and line that I was listening to and story and structure and character, everything led to Hera dying.
She should have died. It's what it seemed like. It's what I felt we were.
I'm not saying I wanted her to die. I'm saying you told me she should die. I was prepped for that and it made sense. And instead we have this like incredible adventurous independent woman going off on adventures, and you're supposed to have me believe that I never hear a story about her.
Well,
I
and
no.
yeah, I was, yeah, I like she said she has that moment where, you know, she's in the wedding dress and
Oh,
she
and I'm betrothed to death.
I'm betrothed to
I'm
death, and I was
pledged
like,
to death.
okay, but then she leaves death
Yeah.
at the altar, right? I mean, like, if you're betrothed to death,
Yeah.
follow through, you
So
know. I
Brave
mean,
Brave Member is asking, what do you think? Why do you think she should have died? So there were a lot of things that just kind of pointed that direction. One, we don't have any stories of her, so
yes,
that kind of makes sense. I think we would have stories of her because of the leader that she was, but that story of Helm and his myth and his legend would have overshadowed everything of that time. So the only story we get is 2 pages on Helm. We forget about Hera. Okay, I can see that. If she
especially
had
if she
lived,
dies. Yes, if she
yeah,
dies, you
if
can
she
see
had
that.
lived,
Yeah,
we would have had stories,
yeah.
no question. Also, because she goes off with the harp at the end, we would have had stories. She would have written them, you know?
That suggests to me that yes, that
Yeah.
was hard. That was hard. That was hard to understand.
Like element one, but we also had her not being promised to anybody. I'm being betrothed to death. I'm pledged to death. Not going off on
The
that.
wedding dress, like, she first discovers the wedding dress, and the old crone is like, oh, don't touch that, it's cursed, it's, you know, like, the one who wore that died, and like, you're bringing it, like, you're bringing that upon yourself if you wear the dress. And then later when she's like, I totally am putting on the dress, like, I'm in, like, I mean, yeah, there were many things. And then even to the moment, like, even to the setup where she's beaten Wolf, and Wolf is there with his knife at his back, and
Yep.
he lunges for, and I thought he'd stabbed her. It looked like
And
he
it
stabbed her. Like, that
and
was
it
the,
would have and it would have worked. Like I was
yeah,
doing this with my husband where I was like, okay, so if that had happened, if she had been stabbed, the perfect ending there would have been Wolf died. We all confirmed that. She spent a little bit of time making sure everybody was okay and walking around and looking to the leaders, talking to her hot cousin and saying everything's okay, and then kicking the bucket because
yeah,
she would have filled her duty. And duty is my last little tick of why she should have died because her role was to carry on the line, to be there for her people. The last thing she would do if she carried on living was abandon them. I know she thought there were adventures and things that needed to be taken care of, but I also didn't believe that she would have been like, oh, my brothers and my dad are dead. Here, cousin, you can take over. I thought her responsibility would have been to stay with her people and have that loyalty there. And maybe there would be some adventures that called her off, but not this like independent streak. Got to go off and see what's up.
the
It would
gap
be my duty to stay
between,
here.
yes, the I'll go so far as to say the break between, I am taking responsibility for the people, I am not only leading, I am sacrificing myself so that they can get away. I am taking the, you know, I'm going to be the one defending the kingdom and everything. And then after the, and then the next thing we see is like, la-di-da, I'm leaving to go do I
Yeah.
don't know what in particular. I'm
And she
leaving
even
behind the people that I saved. I'm leaving behind the cousin that I love, and whatever. I'm just like going to do I have no idea what.
and
Um,
she even had this line that was like, I never the crown was never for me. I never craved the crown, something like that.
right.
Where I'm like,
Really?
that's not your decision.
No.
You don't get to crave it. You have it.
You're
It
right.
is
This
yours.
is right. You're not trying to become. Like, you were in the ruling family. Like,
Yeah,
you're the
like
last member of the line of the first kings. Yes.
and if anything, duty, loyalty, you know, task like that is core to the Rohan ethics that it just jarred so massively when she
Yeah.
said that. Yeah.
Yeah. My wife was incensed at the ending. She was incensed.
Oh dear.
She was like, she did the worst possible thing. She, like, the only worst and most selfish thing she could possibly have done. Like, she should, like, A, she should have died. B, even if she hadn't died, she should have either become ruler, or she should have married her cousin to
I knew you were
cement
going to say that.
the
Yeah.
line.
Yeah.
And anyway, this is, my wife was like, I can't believe she did not marry the hot cousin. Like, she's like, I thought the entire film was building up to that when she
I
didn't
didn't
die.
feel that way, but I can see that, Bridget.
Yeah, and mine too. Like, when I was talking to my wife afterwards, I was like, I didn't get that. But then I watched it a second time, and I was really paying attention because my wife had pointed it out, and the early interactions between Helm and Freyalf, and I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I see what my wife was
see it.
picking up on there.
it.
I
Yeah.
was missing it because in my head, I'm like, it's Freyalf. I know what's going to happen with Freyalf, right? So I already had him pegged. But to someone who came in without those kind of contextual cues and was just building on the cues of the story itself, the cues that my wife was picking up very clearly were like, Freyalf and Hera are destined for each other. And then when it comes to the end with him in the kingship, but he's only the nephew and he's not the son, but the daughter still lives, which means if she marries somebody else and has kids, there could potentially be a dynastic issue later on.
Yes.
This one is the descendant of Helm Hammerhand, when you have like the grandson of Helm Hammerhand running around and, the sons of Freyalf, what is going to happen and everything. And so again, like the traditional, as my wife was saying, you're like, there's a traditional solution to this kind of a problem, and that's marry the two of them. Yes, they're first cousins, and yes, it's going to gross out modern audiences, but that's absolutely what would have happened, and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, and there were a couple of instances too where it's like, okay, but somebody had to go off on that little ring story, right? Like they had to chase down. There's that little mention of Sauron and rings and Mordor, and I enjoyed that. A lot of people thought that was tokenistic, but I thought that was actually like a nice way to tie it into the world that we know. Olwen would have been phenomenal at doing that and
Mm-hmm.
not have had a lady to look after.
Mm-hmm.
Like she could have been the one to go off on that adventure and carry on Hera's legacy, task, whatever, had she died.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The other thing that I think just kind of made me twitchy about the ending, I didn't like the circle. Like the last shot that we get of her is almost identical to those opening shots with voiceover dialogue that is almost like voiceover lines almost identical. It literally repeats what happened at the very beginning. And so that felt really weird to me because it was like, so we've gone nowhere. Like all this happened and nothing was accomplished. She's the same exact person she always was, except now she no longer like good riddance. She's got rid of her father and brothers and now has the freedom to go off on her own and indulge the desires that she always had but couldn't indulge because she had to go home and do her duty. And now she's been freed of the fortuitous death of her whole family has left her.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not saying I think that's what the message is, but that's the thing that was kind of twitching at me that I was like, where's the progress? Like, has she not been changed at all by what happened? By the circumstances. Anyway, that was hard to take. And which again, I'm like, give me a funeral. A funeral would have been a great ending.
Oh, there's so many bits. And this, I don't have a full circle to this, but like even the mother in the dress, I thought was a missed opportunity. Like they say mother didn't last, long after she was born. And then we're given this chest with a dress in it. And it's some sort of reference to a shield maiden and the ancient legacy line of these women. Like, make the dress her mother's. Have that crone have something to do because what the heck was her purpose? I thought she was beautiful in terms of like a Ghibli style, but it was very anime. But I did not see her purpose. Like she didn't know there were hidden passages. She didn't know what the stocks were, but she lived there for 40 years, and she wasn't able to do anything except scare us about the dress. Whereas if she had actually been part of the Shield Maiden core, that trio of women between Hera, Owen, and Crone, and then donning the dress, taking up her mother's birthright, that birthright,
Yes.
and like enabling her to put on that helm.
It
Pardon me.
almost got there. It almost got there.
So close.
It almost got there. So the one moment where I felt like, again, the crone was a slightly odd character that didn't seem to me to contribute an enormous amount. But the one moment that I really liked of the crone was when Hera is choosing to wear the gown. There's that one moment right before the final thing where there's this three-way embrace where she and Olwen embrace each other and then the crone comes and embraces them. And that one tableau of like 3 generations of women, the young woman, the middle-aged woman, and the crone, the way that formed this one little silent tableau of like the the tradition of like womanhood passed down from generation to generation, and this kind of intergenerational community, female community support was a beautiful moment. I was like,
Well,
okay, I don't know if that's like justification for the whole, but like for me, the crone was worth it for that moment. I thought that was
but
a
I
really
agree,
beautiful
like
moment.
that moment was amazing.
Yes.
But if that crone had been clearly part of the Shield Maiden
Yes.
journey,
Yes.
and the mother had fit into that with the dress, we would
Yep.
have had four strong,
Yes.
awesome women, you know, but
Yes.
like the visual of that trinity, and we've talked about the trinity and the trio before, and the reference, like what that means on film and what that means for Tolkien, like that would have been so much more powerful. And it was just such a simple thing that I thought could have made it land. But anyway, this is the game that we play with, like, if I had had the script. But an interesting point of this is that Kirsten Cairns, in her interview with the writers, she actually asked them about this. So this is our co-production with OneRing.net, and she's had some chats with the cast and crew about this. And she flat out asked them, you know, are you gonna kill Hera? And we'll have to go through the transcript. But they were basically like, no, we wanted it to end with hope and catastrophe. And I can see why they would say that, but that also made me a little bit sad because it's a missed opportunity that death can't give hope. I thought that is a
Yes.
really beautiful idea, that the death of a character can often be so much more powerful to bring hope.
Yes.
We didn't get that anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, bins are being put out and my dog just snapped to attention. So
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
okay. It's okay.
Oh, and Eric, yeah, I was thinking about the maiden mother crone archetype.
Yes.
In that moment, like I was thinking about that when even the first time that really resonated with. I was like, oh, that's a really really cool
Yes.
tableau there.
Phil, yes, Boromir gave Merry and Pippin hope by dying.
Absolutely, yes. And you would have the Yucatan, the connection. This is what, of course, we don't have time to do a full Eagles discussion, but the introduction of the Eagles into the story, definitely, uh, as the accommodators of eucatastrophe, the bringers of eucatastrophe, right? That was, that would, but again, like that happening, and that happening by Hera's initiation, right? And there was a lot that I really, really liked about that scene. The scene of her climbing up to the eyrie of the eagle, and appealing to, and putting herself in danger, like it could easily have killed her. In some ways, it like almost like ought to have killed her. Like it's at the very least really rude to climb up to the eyrie uninvited of one of the great eagles. But anyway,
Not to mention the ice climbing.
right, there's there's the risking of her life in the dangerous climb, and then there was the submission of
Walking into
herself,
that
like kneeling in front of the eagle, letting it kill her if it chose to kill her, like the kind of bravery there was a lot that I loved about that whole sequence, and the choice of the eagle to help, the connection with hope and the affiliation of Freyalof with hope, and his the armor, the handing off of the armor was a little bit strange, but I liked it. I mean, like it was one of those things. It was one of those things that
I thought the handing off was a bit strange.
Yes.
But the donning was very
was
cool.
awesome. Yeah, no,
That was
it was
very
one of those things where like I'm a lot of times when people are watching movies and TV and saying like, oh, that's unrealistic, that couldn't happen, or that wouldn't happen, or whatever, I'm almost never bothered by those things. Like if a thing works, if the like structure of the story, if like the symbolism of it is effective, I'm there for it. Like I'm willing to suspend disbelief. So I wasn't, and I loved it. I loved the symbol. I loved the symbol of the the eagle bearing the armor to Freyalof, to the symbol of Freyalof's, the choice to identify Freyalof with Helm in the way that they did, I thought was really, really cool. Yeah.
Sorry, Brave Brown Bear. Yes, the ending of Rogue One.
There you go. There you go. That's an excellent illustration.
God, Rogue One I've taught in script classes. It is one of the tightest stories we've got. But
yeah. Yes. Well, see, Eric, that's the thing. If shield sledding while shooting arrows had accomplished something symbolically, I would have been more there for it. I thought it was, in the end, there were too many of the things. Yeah, like how does that function symbolically? It didn't for me anyway. But whatever. But yeah, back to Rogue One. Rogue One is a lovely example of the giving of hope through and despite death. That is a that's a fantastic example.
And I mean, I should say Brave and Bear also said, but I liked that War of Rohirrim was different. So like that is a fantastic example. But I recognize that you're saying you like that the ending was different in War of the Rohirrim. I mean, I think it's going to be a tough one anyway, and it's tough to use the argument there should be songs because there should be songs regardless at this point. Like if she single-handedly saved her people, there should be a song, but there's not. If she went off and had adventures, there should be a song, but there's not. So like we're not really going to win with that argument, but I think all the other things that we were watching just made it seem like she shouldn't have survived this, and it's her death that made other things possible.
Yes.
Instead, we don't know what she did.
And
So
and simply in the sense of it would have been, in my opinion, it would have been a much more satisfying culmination of the way that the story was building.
yes.
Yeah, I think that would have.
And a disappointment that we don't have more information, because if we're to believe that she carried on, I think Tolkien would have noted something down.
Yes. And Eric, I will add that was if I had to choose my least favorite line in the film, my least favorite line was the one where the Eowyn narrator, who, by the way, never identified in the film. If I hadn't known, if you hadn't read the press clippings and you didn't recognize Miranda Otto's voice, you would have had no idea that it was Eowyn giving the voiceover. Like there was no explicit historical connection within the film that rooted that.
See, I liked that.
Yeah, well, the part that I disliked, the my least favorite line was the one where the Eowyn voiceover says, you haven't heard any stories about her, for there were none. Like there were no songs that were made about her. And the thing that I didn't like about that is exactly what Eric just said. If Eowyn knows about it, there would had to have been songs. So I was when I was sitting there watching it the second time, I was like, so what are we implying that Eowyn is making this up out of whole cloth? Like, yeah.
I wonder, I mean, I don't know this, but I'm like, I wonder if because they never identified it as Eowyn, we don't get to make that assumption that it's Eowyn telling us the story.
Well, that's
We
it.
just-
And
We
that's
just, as fans, know that
Right.
we have this familiar voice.
and that's the
but
thing that I disliked about it, because Tolkien, it is an enormously, it's a very Tolkien thing, right? To not only tell a story, but to tell the story about how that story came to be and how that story came to be remembered, right? To both give a backstory of the story, who told it and how did they hear it and all of that stuff. And then even a forward version of the story. How did it survive? How is it that we modern people are coming to hear about it, right? Both of those things he provides for the Lord of the Rings, and within the context of the Lord of the Rings often will do that sort of thing. And they, in this film, with the Eowyn frame, they like come within a hair's breadth of providing exactly that really fun Tolkien, but then their own dialogue seems to like back off from it, or I don't know, like it was a moment where I was like, why are you turning away from that? Like, why, what I was expecting was the Eowyn character to be like, you may not have heard some of these stories, but Shield Maidens have handed down the true story, which is not usually told about Helm's Deep. So here is the song, which, though not widely circulated and you might have missed, is the one that you like should know about. Like that's, that is, and that's exactly what Meow indeed was just saying. Yes,
yeah, they
exactly.
could have at least made it a song told mother to daughter, not told in the great tales of men.
Yes.
That's beautiful.
That's
beautiful.
That's what I was kind of expecting and hoping
that
for.
Been great.
Yes. And instead I felt like the film didn't really seem, it put it out there, right? The connection between Eowyn and this older story, right? And Eowyn's the idea of Eowyn being put as narrator into the position of storyteller,
Mm-hmm.
telling and keeping alive the memory of this story, which many have forgotten, right? Like it was right there. It was right there teed up. And then within the narrative, within the dialogue itself, within the lines themselves, it backed off from it. And I was like, oh, come on. Don't go there. If they had just not said that, I would have assumed. Like they could have just left it to us to imagine. Like, oh, okay, so this must be Eowyn telling the story, and therefore she must have heard it and whatever. It's like, so don't actively contradict that in the dialogue.
Give us one.
Yeah, that's why it's again, that's why I felt like that was like a very unsuccessful line, because it seemed to me to contradict. Not just what I was hoping for, but what the shape they seemed to be giving to it. Yeah. And there was this one thing that pointed in this other direction, and I was like, weird.
Guys, this was like barely scraping the surface. I have so many other things I'm going to talk about. But this is why it's been really interesting to do this documentary development, because we want to do a documentary as a studio and show that we can do this and, make this project. But it's very different to the conversation we also need to have just to like purge our souls. Yeah. So there will be other things being filmed as well.
Yeah.
But we need to talk about who's here next week and reiterate the Kickstarter. So next week we are being joined by Daniel Falconer. He was the guy behind the book of Page to Screen for the Tolkien trilogy, the Peter Jackson trilogy. He's been part of Weta since the late 90s, I believe, and has worked on all of the adaptations from Weta to Jackson's universe. He also worked on Narnia, which we fell down a rabbit hole chatting about that for a little while, so that's a separate. And he was fascinating to talk to. It's just very open and warm. And he was the consulting artist between Weta and War of the Rohirrim, and he is authoring the art of the War of Rohirrim, which comes out at the end of February. So clearly we have a lot to talk about. So he is on next week. Same time, same channel, same.
We'll have him on next
Batman.
week.
So yeah, he'll be with us on the 6th. And he's asked Warner's if there's a few things that he can share as well. So we'll see if he's got some imagery to bring along. But yeah, so it's only next week. It's just one episode, but he is more than likely going to be in our documentary as well. So
yes. Yeah.
Facts.
Very exciting. He was the one who co-authored the Peter Jackson book with Kelly Rice, right?
With Kelly Rice.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
very cool.
And very lovely guy. And he's a fan of the show. He's watched us and really likes Other Minds and Hands. So isn't that cool?
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. Somebody who has been involved in, the adaptation world of Tolkien and Lewis for as long as Daniel has is going to be really fun to discuss with.
Bravebound Bear said it sounds like it'll be too short an interview. We met on Zoom like a week or two ago, and it was just supposed to be a handshake of like, hey, nice to meet you face to face. It was like almost 2 hours, and it just became one of those where you're like, oh my god.
And I wasn't even there. It wasn't even me talking.
It was like I'll give you guys one snippet because he said he would like to talk about it as well. But they were talking about the topography of Helm's Deep, and if you look at Helm's Deep in War of the Rohirrim versus the Jackson trilogy, the wall is a different height. And they needed the wall to be really high in War of the Rohirrim so that siege tower would make sense. Like, we need a tower to crash over, so we need that wall to be really high. So what did they do? They break out topography maps, and they look at erosion patterns and see if they can justify how erosion and a dam behind it and a causeway and all these things to make the topography different 187 years before we see it in Two Towers. I was like, oh my god, I love production. I love geeks in production so hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great.
Very cool. Very cool.
Anyway, so we're gonna have fun next week.
Yeah, that'll be great fun. So we'll talk about War of the Rohirrim. We'll talk with him about some of the other stuff that he's worked on, and in the meantime, Kickstarter for the documentary that we're working on. Wanted to definitely commend this to people again. If you go to Kickstarter, look for Rings and Realms. It's our documentary there. But
it's only 2 more weeks, so definitely share it in all your networks. We would be really grateful make sure we can get it done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, gang.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks
See
for
you next
joining us.
week.
Look forward to our discussion with Daniel Falconer next week. Very good. Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care.
Have a good New Year's. See you in 2025. Bye now.
See ya.